I'm the last of 11 children, so there are lots of stories between us all. I was born in Indiana, but when I was 4, we moved to the state of Arkansas. Years later, I was visiting my older sister, and the conversation turned to the old house we used to live in, and she asked me, "You were so young when we moved away from that house. Do you have any real memories of it?" I explained to her that I had a few fleeting memories, but the only one that really stuck out is the one day I was walking to the bathroom from the living room. In order to do this, you had to enter the kitchen and then take a left turn. In our kitchen, the sink was below a large window, and on the other side of that large window was a pitch of angled roof about 2 feet wide that was above the stairs that went down to our cellar. When we were young, we used to play a game we called Dairy Queen. We would sit on this pitch of roof while our mother handed us drinks through the window like a drive-through. Well, anyway, I explained to her that on the day in question, I was walking to the bathroom and I had noticed something out of the corner of my eye. I looked over and saw a young girl sitting on the pitch of roof outside the window looking in the window. I told her that I remembered this because it was so unusual and I did not recognize the girl. I explained to her that she, to the best of my recollection, looked to be about 10 or 11 years old. She had short red hair and thick plastic framed glasses. Well, I have no memory of what I did. I don't know if I went to get my mother or just ignored it. Again, I was like 4 years old. As I was telling the story, I was absent-mindedly fiddling with my phone, and when I looked up, my older sister had tears in her eyes and was visibly shaken and ghostly white. Through her tears, she told me that when she was about 7 years old, that she was in the kitchen with a lot of our other siblings getting a drink and looked up in that window and saw a little girl that she described as about 10 or 11 years old, short red hair, with large plastic framed glasses. This would have been about 2 years before I was even born, and about 6 years before I saw this girl. Well, a few days later, another one of my sisters, who is in between us in age, came over to visit as well. As my older sister was telling the younger sister about this, she also started crying. She said she saw the exact same girl about 2 or 3 years after my older sister had seen her, and a few years before I saw her. My mother, who was the ultimate skeptic and believed in nothing even remotely supernatural, told us through her eye rolls that the lady we bought the house from had a young granddaughter who passed away when she was young. She didn't remember much about the girl, but she did tell us that the preacher who was in charge of the church that we attended when we lived there was still the preacher and had been the preacher for many years before we had gone there. When my younger sister got back home, she went to the church and told a little white lie to the preacher that she was doing some research on the old house and that our mother had told her about the lady we bought the house from and the unfortunate passing of her granddaughter. The preacher said, "Oh, yes, that was most unfortunate. She was such a sweet little girl and we loved having her here." My sister said, "My mom didn't remember much about her. Do you remember what she looked like?" I'm sure you can see exactly where this is going. But the preacher said, "Oh, yes, she was adorable. She had the cutest red hair, and the poor little girl didn't see well because she had Down syndrome, so she had really thick black plastic framed glasses." He must not have noticed the panic on my sister's face because he then told my sister, "In fact, her headstone is in the cemetery behind the church if you'd like to go see it." My sister, in fact, did not want to go see it and immediately excused herself and got out of there. So, yeah, while I roll my eyes at 99% of ghost stories, I am absolutely certain that I've seen one. I definitely believe in ghosts, but the creepiest experiences I have ever had was in my wife's old apartment back when we were dating. It is a single family residence in the Boston area and probably about 100 years old, maybe a little older. It's hard to explain, but over the 18 months she lived there, I became convinced that there was a spirit in the home who did not like men. And there was especially negative energy in my wife's bedroom on the first floor and in the basement. Now, I'm not a psychic, so here's what I mean. Every time a man was in the house, myself or her roommates, boyfriends, friends, it felt like someone was watching you. It got to the point we couldn't have intimate time because, again, hard to explain, but every nerve in my body was screaming someone was in the room watching me. Every time a man slept over, we would go to sleep, if I could at all, and in the morning, every single drawer and cabinet in the kitchen would be wide open. I'm talking 20 to 30 drawers and cabinets. My wife was like, "Oh, the cat must have knocked them open." Repeatedly? In places above the sink? And pulled out the drawers? Really? Speaking of that cat, it was a super friendly, playful cat, loved chasing lasers and being pet. On many occasions, the room would suddenly get stuffy and muted, and during these times, the cat would often freeze, stop what it was doing, stare at a random point in the room, and hiss. The cat would also never go into my wife's room, ever. The basement was creepy as all hell, and as a grown man, I was sketched out when doing laundry. I always felt like I was being watched, and while nothing ever happened again, the feeling I had when down there was pure fear, like I have never felt. Things came to a head one night when I wasn't there. My wife's roommate, their bedroom was up on the half floor, was sick, so she slept on the couch in the living room. Her boyfriend stayed upstairs in the bedroom. In the middle of the night, he woke up screaming bloody murder. Apparently, he snapped awake in a sweat, and there was a girl standing in the corner with her face to the wall. He called out his girlfriend's name because he thought it was her, and the girl turned around, and it clearly wasn't her, because in this guy's words, she had markings like claw marks all over her face, and her mouth opened, and she just screamed at me. So I screamed. That was enough for me to never spend the night there again. My wife is a skeptic and sort of laughs it off, but it has never happened in any place we have lived in since. And her roommates from that time definitely believe something was up. My grandma died when I was about 17. My niece was around 4 or 5, very self aware, and the death of her great grandma was very confusing for her since it was her first loss. She would bring it up a lot at the most random times and want to talk about great grandma Kay. In hindsight, this was probably healthy, but it always made everyone uncomfortable because once she started, she just would not drop it, and you'd be caught in a long, painful conversation that always ended with us having to reiterate Grandma was dead, gone forever, and never coming back. Well, one night my niece was getting ready for bed and wanted to go through a book I had gotten for her. It was that huge book of pictures from the Hubble telescope. As we were looking through it, and my niece was asking me a few questions about all the stars and stuff, my great oratory skills must have done something to spark in her little mind the sheer magnitude of the spectacle we were seeing. She suddenly asked if that space was where great grandma was. I started to explain in the best way I could that I didn't really understand what she meant, and that though some people believe you go somewhere, when you die. I personally didn't, and whatever else. Then she said she had some of Great Grandma's jewelry and wanted to show me, and pulled a little box she had hidden away in the bed full of my grandma's costume jewelry and some other effects. Things started to get a little intense at this point. We were alone in this back bedroom, and my sister was quite a ways away, no one else in the house. My niece was all wrapped up in her bed, an electric heater humming along beside her, and an old tiny TV was playing some Disney movie in a corner. She asked another question, which I've since forgotten what it was, and as I started to talk, in no particular order, I felt a cold breeze over my neck, and my hair was standing straight on end. The heater, which had been mostly silent, made a very violent bang, and a primal fear gripped me. On a dime, the room was like energized, hanging on a knife edge. I stopped talking, looked at my niece, and watched her sit up looking at the corner of the room and say, "Grandma?" I followed her eyes to that corner. The door was barely cracked, and between where it swung open and a closet stood, there was a small dark space with a coat rack. A bathrobe hung on the coat rack with a scarf wrapped among the hooks over it. My grandma died from cancer and had been wasting away for over a year. When she died, she weighed less than 80 pounds and walked around in a bathrobe with a scarf wrapped around her head. I'm not sure what I saw exactly, but it was like a small shrunken form that was like with the bathrobe and the scarf, and it took form in that space. The cliche about your blood running cold is legit. I hit the F and eject button on the whole situation and looked away, standing up and loudly saying, "Okay, that's enough of that," and broke my niece's attention from whatever was going on over there. Adrenaline or whatever it was, I didn't even bother to check the situation again and walked over and opened the door, mostly covering up the space with the coat rack with the door, and getting my sister. Now, my sister is an evil woman and was very angry about this bedtime disturbance. She passed me in the hall on the way back, and I heard as she walked into the room behind me, my niece say, "Mom, we saw Grandma." And my sister cut her off, yelling that it is bedtime and she needed to cut the grandma crap and go to bed and whatever else. I felt bad that she was getting in trouble and was also a little ashamed and embarrassed about what just happened, so I just kind of lingered outside sheepishly. My sister has gotten progressively worse since then and eventually lost custody of my niece for being terrible. Anyway, my niece seeing a ghost and then getting yelled at for it put a weird cap on the whole experience. I eventually went back in there after promising my sister no more crap and tucked my niece in. She kept trying to ask me quietly if I saw her too, and I just ignored the question and said, "It's time for bed. Good night. We'll go do something fun tomorrow." It's been years since this happened, and my niece is growing up into quite the little stinker, swapping her grainy old Disney movies on a 20-inch TV for an iPad and TikTok, and the cold back bedroom she shared with her mom into her own big new room now at her dad's house. But she's asked me a few times since then, "Do you remember when we saw Grandma?" I've never given her an answer, but would like to someday. I'm just not sure what to say. I don't believe in ghosts, and I was really high at the time, probably in a mentally suggestible space because of it. I'm not sure enough of what I saw, but there is no doubt that the heater made that loud banging sound, and it had never made that before or since. And I have no explanation for how absolutely and how suddenly I went from completely fine to absolutely gripped by cold fear. The whole room went from perfectly normal to synced up, energized, and very, very cold before I even knew what was happening.